What if I told you that history's greatest strategic victory wasn't won by Caesar, Alexander, or Napoleon, but by 12 complete failures? Fishermen, tax collectors, and nobodies who had zero political experience, no military training, and absolutely no business challenging the most powerful empire on Earth. Yet somehow, these 12 misfits didn't just survive. They completely revolutionized human civilization. While the brilliant minds of their time are forgotten footnotes, their movement still shapes 3 billion lives today. How did 12 ordinary people with extraordinary failures outsmart every genius of the Roman Empire? The answer will shatter everything you think you know about success, power, and what it really takes to change the world forever. If you're building anything that matters, the most powerful psychological weapons in history were hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. These mental structures will revolutionize how you think about failure forever. Here's what everyone gets wrong about the 12 apostles. History paints them as these holy, perfect disciples who immediately understood their divine calling. But that's complete nonsense. These weren't spiritual geniuses. They were society's rejects who had already failed at everything else. Peter, a fisherman who couldn't even keep his mouth shut when it mattered most. He literally denied knowing Jesus 3 times when the pressure was on. Matthew was a tax collector, basically the most hated profession in ancient Palestine. These guys were collaborating with the Roman occupiers, stealing from their own people. James and John, so hot-headed that Jesus nicknamed them Sons of Thunder because they wanted to call down fire from heaven to destroy entire villages that didn't welcome them. And here's the kicker: they were all trying to figure out how to get positions of power in what they thought would be an earthly kingdom. They were constantly arguing about who would sit at the right hand of the throne. They completely missed the point of everything they were being taught. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Roman governors. These were the actual geniuses of their time. They had decades of education, sophisticated theological training, political networks that spanned the empire, and military backing that could crush any uprising in days. They understood power structures, had mastered the art of influence, and knew exactly how the game was played. So when this ragtag group of misfits started gaining followers, the establishment didn't take them seriously. Why would they? These 12 had already demonstrated their incompetence in their previous careers. They had no credentials, no backing, no strategic plan. They were just ordinary failures who happened to be following a carpenter from a backwater town. But here's where the mystery deepens. While the brilliant religious and political minds of the day remained stuck in their rigid thinking patterns, something extraordinary was happening to these 12 failures. They were developing what modern psychology calls cognitive flexibility, the ability to adapt their mental frameworks when confronted with new information. The geniuses of their time couldn't do this. They were too invested in their existing belief systems, too committed to their intellectual pride, too trapped by their previous successes. But the apostles, they had nothing to lose. Their failures had actually prepared them for the greatest strategic advantage in human psychology. Here's the psychological secret that nobody talks about. Cognitive flexibility is inversely related to expertise. The more you know about something, the harder it becomes to see alternative possibilities. This is called the curse of knowledge in modern psychology, and it's why experts consistently fail to predict paradigm shifts. The Pharisees had spent their entire lives memorizing thousands of religious laws. They could recite scripture backwards and forwards, but this expertise became their prison. When faced with new information that contradicted their framework, their brains literally couldn't process it. It's like trying to run new software on an old operating system. The system just rejects it. But look at what happened to the apostles. Peter went from denying Christ to becoming the rock upon which the entire movement was built. Matthew transformed from a selfish tax collector to someone who would die for his beliefs. Thomas went from being the ultimate skeptic to traveling to India to spread the message. This wasn't just character development. This was complete cognitive rewiring. The breakthrough moment came after the crucifixion. While the religious establishment celebrated their victory over this false teacher, the apostles experienced something that shattered their existing mental models completely. Whether you believe in the resurrection literally or see it as a powerful psychological transformation doesn't matter for our analysis. What matters is that their entire framework for understanding reality got obliterated and rebuilt from scratch. This cognitive destruction was actually their greatest asset. In psychology, we call this unlearning, the ability to abandon old mental patterns that no longer serve you. The apostles didn't just learn new information. They underwent complete psychological reconstruction. Their failures had made them neurologically plastic in ways that the rigid, educated minds of their time simply couldn't match. And here's the genius part. They didn't try to work within the existing system. The Pharisees were trying to maintain their position within the Roman power structure. The Sadducees were collaborating with the empire to preserve their influence. But the apostles, they completely ignored the established rules of the game. They started speaking to crowds without permission from religious authorities. They performed healings without medical training. They challenged both Roman law and Jewish traditions simultaneously. From a strategic standpoint, this should have been suicide. But their cognitive flexibility allowed them to see opportunities that the experts couldn't even recognize. The educated elite were playing chess, while the apostles had invented an entirely new game. And because the establishment couldn't understand the rules of this new game, they had no idea how to stop it. By the time they realized what was happening, the movement had already grown beyond their ability to contain it. This is why failures often become revolutionaries, while geniuses become fossils. Failure strips away your attachment to old ways of thinking. It forces you to question everything you thought you knew. And in that questioning, in that cognitive chaos, lies the seeds of breakthrough innovation. Think of your mind like a river. When you're successful and knowledgeable, your thoughts flow in deep, established channels. These channels are efficient. Water flows fast and smooth. But here's the problem. When the landscape changes, when new tributaries appear, your river can't adapt. It's trapped in its own success. The Pharisees were like the Mississippi River, deep, powerful, but completely locked into its course. For centuries, they had carved their theological channels deeper and deeper. When new information appeared, it couldn't change their direction. They could only flow where they had always flowed. But the apostles, they were like a mountain stream after a storm, chaotic, unpredictable, but incredibly adaptive. They could flow around obstacles, change direction instantly, find new paths that had never existed before. Their failures had kept their mental channels shallow and flexible. This is why Amazon disrupted retail while Sears went bankrupt. Why Netflix killed Blockbuster. Why Tesla is reshaping the entire automotive industry. The established players were rivers with deep channels. The disruptors were mountain streams that could flow anywhere. The apostles understood something that the geniuses of their time missed. In a rapidly changing world, flexibility beats expertise. Adaptation beats knowledge. The ability to unlearn beats the ability to learn. They turned their cognitive chaos into strategic advantage. When Peter was confronted with his failures, he didn't defend them or rationalize them. He let them break him completely, then rebuilt himself from scratch. When Matthew faced his past as a collaborator, he didn't make excuses. He transformed his guilt into revolutionary passion. When Thomas encountered evidence that challenged his skepticism, he didn't cling to doubt. He let his entire worldview collapse and constructed a new one. This cognitive flexibility didn't just help them personally, it became the foundation of their movement's strategy. They could adapt their message to any audience, find common ground with any culture, respond to persecution with tactics that no one could predict. While their enemies were playing by rulebooks, the apostles were writing new rules in real time. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit that subscribe button. Why? Because what comes next will explode your view about power. And if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. Now here's where the story gets truly bizarre. Everything that should have destroyed the apostles actually made them stronger. And I'm not talking about some feel-good motivational nonsense. I'm talking about a specific psychological phenomenon that modern science has only recently begun to understand. Let me paint you the picture of what these 12 faced after their leader was executed. The entire Roman Empire was hunting them down. The Jewish religious establishment wanted them dead. They had no money, no political connections, no military protection. Any rational person would have disbanded the group and gone into hiding. But something impossible happened instead. Every persecution, every beating, every arrest made their movement grow faster. When Stephen was stoned to death, instead of scaring people away, it created thousands of new converts. When James was beheaded by King Herod, the remaining apostles didn't retreat, they became more bold. When they were thrown in prison, they turned the guards into believers. The Roman Empire had a standard playbook for dealing with rebellions. You identify the leaders, you eliminate them, and the movement collapses. This had worked for hundreds of years against countless uprisings. But with the apostles, the playbook backfired spectacularly. Here's what's psychologically fascinating. While other religious and political movements of that era became more defensive under pressure, the apostolic movement became more aggressive. While other groups tried to protect their leaders, the apostles actively sought out dangerous situations. While other movements tried to preserve their doctrine, the apostles continuously evolved their approach. The Zealots, for example, were a contemporary Jewish resistance movement. They were brave, they were committed, and they had sophisticated military strategies. But when Rome applied pressure, they became more insular, more paranoid, more rigid. Eventually, they were completely wiped out at Masada. The Essenes were another group, highly spiritual, deeply committed to their beliefs. But when persecution came, they retreated to the desert, isolated themselves, and eventually disappeared from history. Even the Pharisees, when faced with the destruction of the temple, struggled to adapt and maintain their influence. But the apostles did something completely different. Instead of becoming more protective, they became more open. Instead of creating barriers, they broke them down. Instead of defending their territory, they expanded into new territories. Paul, who started as their greatest persecutor, became their most effective evangelist. This wasn't just ironic, it was strategically brilliant. What's the psychological principle at work here? Why did adversity strengthen them while it destroyed everyone else? The answer lies in how they had structured their entire movement from the beginning. They had accidentally created what researchers now call an anti-fragile system. Something that doesn't just survive stress, but actually grows stronger because of it. Here's the secret. The apostles had unknowingly designed their movement using the most powerful organizational structure in human psychology. Distributed network leadership with ideological redundancy. Let me break this down because it's absolutely crucial. Traditional power structures are fragile because they depend on key nodes. Kill the king and the kingdom falls. Eliminate the general and the army scatters. This is exactly what Rome expected to happen with Christianity. Take out the leaders and the whole thing collapses. But the apostles had created something completely different. Each of them could function independently, but they were all connected by the same core ideology. When you attacked one node, the other nodes didn't weaken. They absorbed the energy of the attack and redirected it into growth. Think about it strategically. When Peter was imprisoned, John didn't go into hiding. He became more active. When James was killed, Paul didn't retreat. He launched new missions. When they scattered due to persecution, they didn't fragment. They planted seeds in new territories. Every setback created new opportunities that they were psychologically prepared to exploit. But here's the deeper psychological insight. The apostles had internalized what modern psychology calls a growth mindset on steroids. They didn't see persecution as evidence that they were failing. They saw it as confirmation that they were succeeding. This cognitive reframe transformed every obstacle into fuel for expansion. The Romans were operating from a scarcity mindset. They saw power as finite. If someone else gains influence, they lose influence. But the apostles operated from an abundance mindset. They believed their message could transform anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. This wasn't just optimism. It was a completely different way of processing reality. When Paul was beaten and imprisoned in Philippi, he didn't focus on the pain or injustice. He focused on the fact that he had reached the jailer and his entire family. When he was shipwrecked on Malta, he didn't see it as a disaster. He saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate divine power to a new population. This psychological resilience wasn't just individual, it was systemic. They had created feedback loops where persecution actually accelerated their growth. Every martyr became a story that inspired 10 more converts. Every arrest became an opportunity to reach new audiences. Every setback became a setup for expansion. The Romans couldn't understand this psychology because it violated everything they knew about human nature. In their experience, when you inflicted enough pain, people backed down. When you demonstrated enough power, people submitted. But the apostles had somehow transcended normal pain-pleasure calculations. They had tapped into what psychologists now call post-traumatic growth. The phenomenon where individuals don't just recover from trauma, but actually develop greater psychological strength than they had before. Except they had systematized this on a movement-wide scale. The result was devastating for their opponents. Every weapon the establishment used against them made them stronger. Every strategy designed to limit their influence expanded their reach. The harder Rome and the religious authorities pushed, the faster the movement grew. It was like trying to stop water by hitting it with a hammer. You just create more splash. Imagine trying to destroy a dandelion by cutting off its flower. What happens? Within days, you don't have one dandelion, you have 50. That single flower contained hundreds of seeds that are now scattered everywhere, taking root in places you never expected. The Roman Empire was like a gardener trying to maintain a perfect lawn by eliminating weeds one at a time. They had sophisticated tools, detailed strategies, and centuries of experience. But they were dealing with the wrong kind of plant. The apostolic movement wasn't like the carefully cultivated religious and political structures of their time. Those were like rose gardens, beautiful, organized, but requiring constant maintenance and protection from harsh conditions. One bad storm, one neglectful season, and the whole garden could be destroyed. But the apostles had created something that operated like a wild ecosystem. When you attack one part, the other parts don't just survive. They use the nutrients from the destroyed section to grow stronger. When you try to contain it, it finds new ways to spread. When you adapt your defenses, it evolves new strategies. This is why every persecution backfired. The Romans would arrest apostles in one city, thinking they had solved the problem. But those arrests created stories that spread to 10 other cities. They would execute leaders expecting to demoralize the followers. But those executions inspired martyrdom narratives that attracted thousands of new converts. The psychological principle is called hormesis, the idea that small amounts of stress actually strengthen a system rather than weakening it. Just like your muscles grow stronger when they're stressed by exercise, the apostolic movement grew stronger when it was stressed by persecution. But here's what made them truly anti-fragile. They had learned to extract benefit from randomness and chaos. When unexpected opportunities appeared, they were psychologically prepared to seize them. When crisis struck, they had mental frameworks that allowed them to see possibilities instead of just problems. Paul's imprisonment in Rome should have been the end of his influence. Instead, he wrote letters from prison that became the foundation of Christian theology. Peter's denial of Christ should have disqualified him from leadership. Instead, it became the source of his empathy and authenticity that made him unstoppable as a communicator. They had mastered the ultimate strategic secret: how to transform setbacks into setups, obstacles into opportunities, and enemies into allies. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Hit that like now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the secrets I'll reveal in upcoming videos. Now we come to the most counterintuitive secret of all. The apostles' greatest strategic advantage wasn't their wisdom, their courage, or even their unity. It was their complete ignorance of how power actually worked. And this ignorance allowed them to break rules that everyone else was too sophisticated to even question. Let me show you what I mean. Every successful movement in Roman history followed predictable patterns. You built coalitions with existing power brokers. You worked within established legal frameworks. You gained legitimacy through recognized institutions. You accumulated resources before challenging authority. You protected your leadership structure. You consolidated territory before expanding. The apostles violated every single one of these rules, not because they were rebellious, but because they didn't even know the rules existed. They were too unsophisticated to understand that what they were attempting was impossible. Paul, for instance, walked into synagogues and announced that the Messiah had already come, to audiences that had been waiting for this moment for centuries and had very specific ideas about what it would look like. From a strategic standpoint, this was insane. You don't challenge people's most fundamental beliefs in their own sacred spaces. Peter stood up in Jerusalem, the heart of Jewish religious authority, and declared that the religious leaders had murdered their own Messiah. He did this without military protection, political backing, or even an escape plan. Any competent strategist would have told him he was committing suicide. The apostles sent missionaries into hostile territories with no resources, no local connections, and no backup plans. They challenged Roman law by refusing to participate in emperor worship, but they didn't organize politically to change the laws. They critiqued both Jewish and pagan traditions simultaneously, making enemies of everyone who mattered. But here's what's psychologically fascinating. Their naivety protected them from the paralysis that comes with understanding the true scope of what you're attempting. When you really comprehend how impossible your goal is, when you fully grasp the forces arrayed against you, when you understand the historical precedents for failure, you often never begin. The educated elites of their time knew too much. They understood the complexity of Roman bureaucracy, the intricacies of Jewish law, the delicate balance of regional politics. This knowledge made them cautious, strategic, calculated. They spent more time analyzing risks than taking action. But the apostles operated from what psychologists now call optimism bias, the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of positive outcomes and underestimate obstacles. Normally, this is considered a cognitive error, but in their case, this error became their greatest strategic asset. They made decisions that seasoned politicians would never make, took risks that experienced military leaders would never accept, and pursued goals that sophisticated philosophers would never attempt. Their ignorance of conventional wisdom allowed them to access strategies that conventional wisdom had declared impossible. Here's the psychological principle that explains everything. Sophisticated knowledge creates sophisticated obstacles. The more you understand about why something can't be done, the more barriers your own mind creates. But naive optimism bypasses all those mental barriers entirely. Let me give you a modern example. When Elon Musk decided to create Tesla, every automotive expert told him it was impossible. They knew about manufacturing complexities, supply chain challenges, dealer networks, regulatory hurdles, and capital requirements. Their expertise created mental limitations that prevented them from even attempting what Musk achieved. But Musk had enough naivety about the automotive industry to ignore expert opinions and try anyway. His ignorance of how things work allowed him to envision how things could work differently. The apostles operated with this same strategic naivety, but on a much grander scale. They didn't understand that you can't change the world's dominant religion with 12 people. They didn't realize that you can't challenge the Roman Empire without an army. They didn't grasp that you can't transform cultures without political institutions. So they just started doing it anyway. This created what psychologists call beginner's mind. The ability to approach problems without preconceived limitations. While the Pharisees were constrained by their knowledge of religious tradition, the apostles could imagine entirely new ways of being spiritual. While Roman officials were limited by their understanding of imperial policy, the apostles could envision completely different relationships between authority and service. But here's the deeper secret. Their naivety wasn't just about lacking information. It was about maintaining psychological flexibility in the face of opposition. When experts told them something was impossible, they didn't argue with the logic. They simply ignored it and continued with their mission. This drove their opponents absolutely crazy. How do you defeat someone who won't acknowledge that they're supposed to be defeated? How do you use intimidation against people who don't understand that they should be intimidated? How do you leverage institutional power against individuals who don't recognize institutional authority? The Romans had sophisticated methods for dealing with sophisticated opponents. They could outmaneuver politicians, outnegotiate diplomats, and outfight armies. But they had no protocols for dealing with people who operated from completely different assumptions about how reality worked. When Paul was imprisoned, he used his time to write letters that spread his influence far beyond what he could have achieved if he had remained free. When the apostles were forbidden to preach, they interpreted this as confirmation that their message was powerful enough to threaten the establishment. When they were scattered by persecution, they saw this as an opportunity to reach new populations. Their naivety protected them from despair because they never fully grasped how hopeless their situation was supposed to be. Their ignorance of political realities allowed them to focus entirely on what they believed was possible rather than what experts believed was probable. This is why innovation almost always comes from outsiders rather than insiders. Insiders know too much about why things can't change. Outsiders don't know enough to be stopped by that knowledge. The apostles were the ultimate outsiders, and their outsider perspective became their ultimate advantage. Think of expertise like a detailed map of a territory. The map shows you all the roads, all the obstacles, all the dangerous areas to avoid. It's incredibly useful for navigating efficiently within known parameters. But here's the problem. Maps also show you where you can't go. The religious and political experts of the apostles' time had incredibly detailed maps of power. They knew every route, every shortcut, every dead end. But their maps also showed them that certain territories were completely inaccessible. You can't challenge Rome and survive. You can't change Judaism from the outside. You can't reach all nations with one message. The apostles, however, were operating without maps. They didn't know where the roads were supposed to lead, so they created new paths. They didn't know which territories were off limits, so they explored everywhere. They didn't know what was impossible, so they attempted everything. This is like a child trying to build a flying machine because no one has told them yet that humans can't fly. While adults are constrained by their knowledge of physics and engineering limitations, the child is free to imagine solutions that adults can't see. Sometimes that childlike naivety leads to breakthrough innovations that expertise would have prevented. The apostles maintained this beginner's mind throughout their entire mission. When people told them their approach wouldn't work, they didn't waste time defending their strategy. They just continued implementing it. When obstacles appeared, they didn't analyze why those obstacles proved their mission was flawed. They figured out how to go around them. Their strategic naivety created a psychological immunity to discouragement. They couldn't be talked out of their mission because they never fully understood why they should be talked out of it. They couldn't be intimidated by powerful opponents because they never grasped the full extent of those opponents' power. This wasn't stupidity, it was strategic innocence. They preserved their ability to see possibilities that experience would have hidden from them. They maintained their capacity for hope in situations where knowledge would have created despair. While their sophisticated opponents were paralyzed by their understanding of complexity, the apostles were liberated by their embrace of simplicity. They had one message, one mission, and one method. Share what they had experienced and let others decide for themselves. The 12 apostles didn't succeed despite their failures. They succeeded because of their failures. Their cognitive flexibility, anti-fragile structure, and strategic naivety created a perfect storm of psychological advantages that the geniuses of their time couldn't match. While experts were trapped by their knowledge, the apostles were freed by their ignorance. While sophisticated leaders were paralyzed by complexity, these simple men were empowered by clarity. They proved that in a world obsessed with credentials and expertise, sometimes the greatest advantage is knowing nothing about the rules that everyone else accepts as unchangeable. The outsiders became insiders by refusing to play the insider's game. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need to see my next videos, but only if you hit that bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful secrets in history. What's your opinion about the ideas presented in this content? Leave in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp perception. This analysis is speculative and based on historical interpretations, not clinical psychological diagnosis.